Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're taking a deep dive into James Buchanan's presidency. He was the 15th U.S. president, serving right before the Civil War, from 1857 to 61.
A really critical time.
Absolutely. And you, our listener, have shared some great material info from Lancaster history about Wheatland, his home. Then there's the White House Historical Association's take, and a pretty detailed Wikipedia entry.
Yeah, quite a bit to work with.
So our mission here is to really unpack the key moments and, decisions of his presidency using these sources. We want to understand this pivotal period better.
Sounds good. Where should we start? With Buchanan himself.
Yeah, who was James Buchanan before he stepped into the White House at such a tense time?
Well, he was born back in 1791 in Pennsylvania, and he had this incredibly long political career before becoming president. I mean, really extensive.
Like what specifically?
Okay, so 5 terms in the House of Representatives. Then he was U.S. Minister to Russia, then a U.S. Senator, then Secretary of State under President Polk, and finally, U.S. Minister to Great Britain just before the presidency.
Wow. That's quite the resume. Decades of experience.
It really is. And interestingly, that last post, being Minister to Great Britain, it actually kind of helped him get the Democratic nomination in 1856.
How so? Because he was out of the country.
Exactly. Being abroad kept him sort of removed from the really heated day-to-day fights over slavery back home. So his own views weren't quite as, publicly pinned down, made him acceptable to more factions within the party.
Ah, okay. So being away softened his image, politically speaking.
Pretty much. So in the 56 election, he ran against John C. Fremont, the Republican, and Millard Fillmore, who was running on the Know-Nothing ticket.
Right.
And Buchanan won. Though it's worth noting, not with a majority of the popular vote, he got about 45%. And 174 electoral votes.
And what was his stated goal coming into office, given the tensions?
He had this, very ambitious aim. He said he wanted to, quote, destroy sectional party, North or South, and to restore harmony to the Union under a national and conservative government.
A tall order, even then.
Extremely. And just a side note, kind of a historical curiosity. He's the only U.S. president who never married.
That is interesting. Okay, so beyond the politics, the sources you shared also mention his home, Wheatland. Tell us about that connection.
Right, Wheatland. In Lancaster, Pennsylvania, it seems to have been really important to him. He bought it in 1848 while he was Secretary of State.
Okay.
And moved in the next year, 1849. It was his home base right up until he died in 1868, except, of course, when he was overseas or in the White House.
It sounds like it was his anchor. He called his household his little family, didn't he? Who was part of that?
Yeah, his little family. That included his niece, Harriet Lane Johnston, and his nephew, James Buchanan, and Henry folks, called him Buck. Buchanan was guardian to both of them.
Oh.
Then also, very significantly, his housekeeper, Esther Parker, known as Miss Hetty.
Harriet Lane.
Mm-hmm.
She often gets called the first lady. Why is that?
Well, since Buchanan was a bachelor, Harriet took on the duties of the official White House hostess. She had done a similar role for him when he was minister in London.
Oh, okay.
And the press really picked up on her role, and that term First Lady started being widely used for her. Apparently, she even became friends with Queen Victoria while in London. She later married and became quite the philanthropist.
Quite a prominent figure then. And the nephew, Buck Henry.
Buck served as his private secretary, like a chief of staff today. But their relationship wasn't always smooth. Sources suggest they clashed, especially over Buck's marriage. Buck actually resigned after just a couple of years.
Some family drama there. And Miss Hetty Parker, the housekeeper. 34 years, that's dedication.
Incredible, isn't it? 34 years. She was clearly more than just staff. She was considered part of the household. She even went with him to the White House. Yeah, she was known for being really sharp, managed the household finances, shrewdly wise economy, as one source put it. And apparently she was the only one who could tell Buchanan off without getting into trouble.
That paints a picture.
Yeah.
So Wheatland itself, the building, federal style, the sources say?
Yes, built in 1828, federal style, very symmetrical, influenced by Greek and Roman designs, clean lines, balanced look. It had the main block, 2 wings, 2 main floors, an attic, basement, typical layout for a substantial house of that era.
And it had outbuildings, too. Like what?
Right. Things essential for the time. A privy, a smokehouse for curing meat, and an ice house, basically the pre-refrigeration way to keep food cold. Gives you a real sense of daily life back then.
It does ground it, and it's great that Wheatland is preserved, now part of Lancaster history.
Absolutely. It means people can still visit and connect with that history directly. Lancaster history combined the foundation preserving Wheatland with the County Historical Society. They keep history accessible.
Okay, let's pivot back to the presidency itself. Huge challenges. The Dred Scott decision hit just 2 days after his inauguration. Talk about starting off in a storm.
Yeah, 2 days. It was just
So?
a bombshell. The Supreme Court ruled, essentially, that African Americans weren't citizens, period.
So they couldn't sue in federal court.
Right. And maybe even more explosive, the court said Congress had no power to ban slavery in the territories. That basically wiped out the old Missouri Compromise.
Buchanan's role in this,
Yeah.
it's pretty controversial, isn't
Oh,
it?
very. We know he knew the decision was coming. One of the justices, Robert Grier, also from Pennsylvania, kept him in the loop.
He knew beforehand.
Yes. And in his inaugural address, just before the decision was announced, he talked about the whole territorial slavery question being speedily and finally settled by the court. He urged everyone to accept the ruling before they even knew what it was.
Wow. So he basically tried to preemptively endorse it. What message did that send?
Well, historians mostly see it as a major blunder. He seemed to be aligning himself with the pro-slavery outcome. Instead of settling things, it just threw gasoline on the fire, made the North furious and deepened the divide, arguably pushed the country closer to splitting apart.
Staggering timing. And then, as if that wasn't enough, later that same year, 1857, the economy tanks. The Panic of 1857.
Yes, another crisis. A really sharp economic downturn, bank failures, businesses collapsing. It hit the industrial North particularly hard.
How did Buchanan respond to that?
His background was sort of Jacksonian belief in limited government, so his approach was basically reform, not relief. He didn't think the federal government should or constitutionally could do much direct intervention.
So a hands-off approach.
Pretty much. He urged states to tighten rules on banks, limit credit, and discourage using government bonds to back paper money.
Did that work, or did it just make things worse politically?
Well, the economy did start to recover by '59, but the political damage was done. The panic definitely worsened sectional tensions. Northerners blamed the South, particularly the Tariff of 1857, which had lowered duties. Southerners, like Buchanan, tended to blame Northern speculation.
So again, an event that just drove the wedge deeper.
Seems that way. It also didn't help the federal budget, which was running a deficit by the end of his term. It just felt like everything was pulling the country apart.
It really does. Okay, let's talk about Bleeding Kansas. That conflict had been simmering for a while.
Right, Bleeding Kansas. This was the ongoing, often violent struggle between pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers trying to control Kansas territory as it headed towards statehood. Buchanan wanted Kansas admitted quickly. He seemed to think it would probably become a democratic state.
And he took a side there, too, recognizing the pro-slavery government.
Yes, he backed the pro-slavery Lecompton government and pushed for the acceptance of the Lecompton Constitution. This was hugely controversial.
Even within his own party, right? Stephen Douglas opposed it.
Vigorously. It caused a major split among Democrats. Douglas argued it didn't reflect the will of the people in Kansas.
And ultimately, the Lecompton Constitution failed.
It did. Kansas voters rejected it when it was put to a fair vote. Kansas didn't actually become a state until January 1861, right at the very end of Buchanan's term.
And only then because
By then, enough Southern senators who'd been blocking its admission as a free state had resigned from Congress because their own states were seceding.
Good grief. Every issue just circled back to slavery and disunion. Which brings us squarely to the secession crisis itself. Lincoln gets elected in 1860, and the Deep South starts leaving.
Yeah, the final catastrophic challenge. South Carolina seceded first, followed by others. Buchanan's response here is probably what he's most criticized for.
What was his position?
It was, well, contradictory. He declared secession illegal, flat out. But then he also said the federal government had no constitutional power to force states to stay in the Union.
Illegal, but unstoppable. That sounds paralyzing.
It effectively was. He basically wrung his hands. He asked Congress to call a constitutional convention to propose an amendment protecting slavery everywhere, hoping that might appease the South. But it was too little, too late. His stance was seen by many as weak and indecisive when strong leadership was desperately needed.
So while he's saying he can't act, states are leaving. How many seceded before he left office?
By February 1st, 1861, 7 states had gone. South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. They formed the Confederate States of America.
Were there any last-ditch efforts at compromise?
There were proposals. The Crittenden Compromise was one. It suggested extending the old Missouri Compromise line to the Pacific, protecting slavery south of it. There was also the Corwin Amendment, which would have constitutionally protected slavery where it already existed.
But they failed.
They failed. Neither side, especially the newly elected Republicans and the committed secessionists, was willing to budge on the fundamental issues, primarily the expansion of slavery. The gap had just become too wide by 1860. Political compromise felt impossible.
And the federal forts in the South became a huge problem, right?
Yeah.
Like Fort Sumter.
Absolutely. Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor was the flashpoint. It was federal property in a seceded state. Buchanan initially said it should be held, but then he hesitated about sending reinforcements, fearing it would provoke war.
Did his stance change at all towards the end?
It hardened slightly in the final months. As Southern cabinet members resigned, they were replaced by stauncher Unionists. His administration did make one attempt to resupply Sumter using an unarmed merchant ship, the Star of the West.
How did that go?
Not well. It was fired upon by South Carolina batteries and forced to turn back. So really, Buchanan just ended up handing this explosive situation over to Abraham Lincoln when he took office in March 1861.
So looking back at his whole presidency, how do historians rate him? It sounds pretty bleak.
Overwhelmingly negative, unfortunately. He consistently ranks at or near the bottom in surveys of presidential effectiveness. The main criticisms are his perceived passivity, his inaction during the secession crisis, and his failure to prevent the Union from dissolving.
And the argument that his policies actually favored the South.
Yes, that's a very common view. His handling of Dred Scott, his push for the Lecompton Constitution, these actions alienated the North and many in his own party. They're seen as contributing factors to the crisis.
Are there any counter-arguments, any defense of his actions?
Well, some defenders argue he faced an impossible situation, unprecedented challenges. They might say he managed to keep the peace, however fragile, during his term, holding off the inevitable conflict for a little longer. But that's definitely a minority view.
Jean Baker, his biographer, you mentioned her view earlier. She had a particularly strong critique, didn't she?
She did. Baker argues Buchanan's failure wasn't just inaction, it was a deliberate partiality towards the South. She sees him as an ideologue, too rigid, maybe too confident from his long career, and unwilling to compromise or really grasp the Northern perspective. She suggests his alignment with Southern interests felt almost like a betrayal of his duty to the whole nation.
A profound failure of leadership, as she puts it.
Yes, that's her assessment.
It's a really sobering story, a long career ending in, well, disaster. To sum up, Buchanan's presidency saw the Dred Scott decision blow things up, an economic panic deepen divides, the fight over Kansas rage on, and finally, the Union itself starting to crumble with secession. His choices, his actions, his inactions, they're still intensely debated.
Absolutely. It's a case study in leadership during extreme crisis, and, well, many argue a failure of it.
So, thinking about everything we've discussed, the man, the events, the sources, what's the one thing, if you had to pick, that most shaped his presidency's path towards civil war? Was it Buchanan himself, his ideology, or was the country just unstoppable on that course? That's something for you, the listener, to really ponder. This deep dive gives us a framework, but exploring those sources and other historical views will definitely offer a richer picture of this crucial time. Thanks for joining us.